Alright, back with a surprise weekend upload, which I normally don't do, but this past week was Paris Games Week, and Naoki Hamaguchi as well as Yoshinori Kitase attended with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in tow, and they got to do a really cool Q&A segment with the fans there. So there's a lot of interesting questions that were asked and some really great answers. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe as well. There's a huge back catalog of videos on my channel ranging from FF7 Remake to Rebirth, Resident Evil, some fighting game stuff, and if you go back far enough, you'll find my Friday the 13th and Dissidia NT playthroughs that I did on my channel some moons ago. I had a lot of fun with the Friday the 13th ones in particular, because I really took the time to sit down and edit them to try and make them as fun and entertaining as possible. And if you like short form content, I do have a TikTok channel that I've been using for the past almost a year or so, where I take my YouTube videos and I condense them down into smaller bite-sized videos, if you prefer the short stuff. So getting to this interview, again, this comes to us from FinalFantasyDream.com, which is a French website, so I used Google Translate to translate the article, so there might be some mistranslations here, so take everything with a grain of salt, but upon reading it, everything seems to sound pretty kosher. So getting to that first question, they ask the men about the historical legacy between FF7 Rebirth and the original game. Kitase responds by saying, "When we were thinking about the plan for FF7 Remake, I told the team that we shouldn't be afraid to make drastic changes. The Hamaguchi development team wrote several things to introduce innovative changes of our times while keeping the notable passages of the original. We had to find the balance between the heritage of the game while offering new features that would appeal to new players and experts alike." And that's something that is really a fine, difficult line to toe, is when you're making a remake and also kind of doing a reimagining, so to speak, like we are seeing with the 7 Remake trilogy. You want to change things and update them and make them new, but if you change them too much, you risk alienating your core fan base, and you risk changing too much to the point where it never feels like the OG property anymore. But if you don't change enough, then you're not really innovating on anything either. And I think a franchise that does this really well, damn near perfect, is the Resident Evil remakes. They are the perfect blend of remaking a game while also reimagining certain elements of it and changing up certain scenarios, expanding upon characters, changing up gameplay stuff, even changing whole story events in particular. It's all done really well in a way that's very seamless, and it feels faithful to the original iteration of those games while also being something brand new. And they're doing a really fantastic job of that with 7 Remake, and what we're seeing so far in Rebirth, staying true to those original games while also innovating and making things fresh and fun in terms of the gameplay, but also adding that mystery and intrigue with some new story stuff. So it's a very difficult line to straddle, but I think they're doing a pretty damn good job so far. Up next is a question asking if there was any specific character or scene from Rebirth that stood out to them. Hamaguchi responds, "For the characters in general, we focused on facial expressions. This is important today because we can tell the story differently than 25 years ago, when it was all text. We know that players are very attached to the characters of FF7, and we needed a way to convey emotions in a modern way. In addition to being dubbed in French, we wanted to convey the emotions without words, and I think we succeeded." And the technical aspect of these games is something we've touched upon in prior videos. We learned that the dev team really did work with a lot of hardware limitations on the original FF7, and a lot of what they were trying to convey couldn't be done with the characters' faces. It had to be done through text, and when you're solely relying on text, there's a lot of context that can sometimes get lost because you might read it differently compared to someone else. It's like when you get a text message from somebody and it's really innocent, but the way you read it in your head is like, oh no, is something wrong? Did I mess something up?
Do you even want to hang out?
Do you even want to hang out? Oh, that's considerate. Like I said, whatever.
Like I said, whatever? This guy.
So in this day and age, there's so much more that they can do. And you look at the old school Final Fantasy games, 7, 8, and 9, there was really no facial expressions on the, polygonal characters. It was just their eyes blinking, and all they could really do was move their body in specific ways, like shrug their shoulders, tilt their head, in Barrett's case, shake a lot when he was angry. And nowadays you see what they're doing in Remake, and Barrett has this wide range of emotions that he can now express, not just with his voice, but with his face. anger, excitement, happiness, sadness. You see it all running through his face. And I look at a character like Cloud, who is trying so hard to be stoic and cool, but he's really just a big old nerd. You can see him react with his eyes, not necessarily his whole face, but his eyes give away a lot of how he's feeling. And you couldn't do that back then, but you can now because of how far technology has really, progressed. Again, the Resident Evil games, that RE engine is so powerful that there's so much they can convey with the player faces and motion capture and the voices. It's really crazy to see how far gaming has come since we were kids. Up next, the crowd starts to chant for characters Genesis and Vincent, which is pretty gnarly. Kitase responds by saying, "I can't tell you anything about Genesis," he then proceeds to laugh, "but regarding Vincent, at the time of FF7, I chose his look and his name, so he's an important character for me. You were able to discover him in the trailer for Rebirth, but what's interesting is that now he can talk, and we will thus discover all his facets. I think you're going to discover some very interesting things about him in Rebirth." Again, I fully expect Genesis to show up in this trilogy at some point. If that man shows up spouting Loveless, it's going to be bittersweet, because on the one hand, it'll remind me of Crisis Core, and on the other hand, it'll remind me of why I hated Genesis in Crisis Core. Well, I shouldn't say hate. Hate's a very strong word, but I got kind of annoyed with his character. But in the remake trilogy, I want to see him come back because I want a redemption with the writing. I know they can write him better. I know they can hire some really great voice actors to really give him depth. So I'm very excited to see that aspect potentially play out in this trilogy. And as for Vincent, again, like I brought up earlier, we only had text back in the day, so we had to come up with the character voices in our head, the emotions they were experiencing, and of course, Vincent did eventually get a voice in games like Dirge of Cerberus, the Advent Children movie. I can't recall if he was in any of the Kingdom Hearts games. I don't remember if he was, but his voice has been pretty limited so far, so to have him now voiced in Rebirth by Matt Mercer, we're gonna really hear and feel every emotion Vincent has, and the way that he speaks is going to be honestly new to us, because again, while he was in Advent Children, we're now going to experience the FF7 original Vincent, so to speak, with his voice to really hear how he sounds and how he feels, and it's going to be incredible. Up next, they're asked about the mix of the OG development teams with the younger people and how they plan on passing the torch in the future. Kitase says, "Let me answer this because I've been here since Final Fantasy V. Hamaguchi is part of this new generation, as is Endo-san, the combat director who also joined us recently. There is no real break, but regularly new employees arrive and learn Final Fantasy know-how. That is how it's transmitted. There are two very talented Naokis to watch out for on the Square Enix side. In addition to Naoki Hamaguchi, you might know about Naoki Yoshida, who recently directed 16. I think the future is in their hands." Now again, we've spoken ad nauseum on this channel about the combination of old developers and new developers being lightning in a bottle and making these really special games where you can have the OGs pull from what they knew of the original, but then you got those new developers who grew up playing those games and they can introduce new ideas that would work that maybe the OGs didn't think of. So keeping it young and fresh keeps these games young and fresh moving forward while still keeping some of its, old school identity. In regards to Naoki Yoshida though, I don't foresee him being a part of Final Fantasy, at least mainline, going forward. Based on a video we did recently about who could lead the franchise into the future, Yoshi P did an interview where it sounded like he kind of wants to back off mainline Final Fantasy, focus on 14, but also do his own thing and create his new IP, and I kind of want to see him do that. I'm very mixed on 16. I tend to lean towards not liking it, but there was some really interesting aspects about that game, and I personally would love to see Yoshi P just off of the leash of Final Fantasy, making his own game without the identity of Final Fantasy being incorporated. I really want to see him challenge himself and show us his own unique ideas, so that could be really interesting moving forward. Hamaguchi-san, I fully believe might lead Final Fantasy after this remake trilogy is done, and we could potentially see him as a lead director for Final Fantasy 17 or 18 moving into the future. Up next, we talk about fan feedback, and I am going to address something that happened very recently that's somewhat controversial, even though it shouldn't be, so I've got my soapbox right next to me to get ready for that moment. As you know, FF7 was a story-driven game. People really liked it, but they also wanted to be able to walk around and go wherever they wanted at any time. It is this kind of comment that encourages us to improve freedom of action. Some players liked FF7 Remake, but felt a need for exploration. This will be more the case here, with much more freedom. Which again, by virtue of being in Midgar, 7 Remake was going to be very linear, because that's how it was in the original game. Once you left Midgar, that's when things started to open up. But I felt like they did a pretty good job in Remake letting us explore and do side quests and trying to make certain areas as big as they possibly could, with the location and story limitations that they had placed upon them. Up next is Kitase. We game designers are very interested in player feedback, and we look at social media, so don't hesitate to give your opinion on the internet or by meeting us like today. All your comments are important, and I will leave with them, which is great. If you have constructive criticism that can help the developers improve upon gameplay, combat, some, pacing issues maybe, that's great. Speak your mind. But there was an incident that occurred recently with Nojima-san, who is the scenario writer for the OG FF7. He's also working on 7 Remakes trilogy, and he had to make a post on Twitter asking people to leave him alone because he was being harassed by a toxic section of the Final Fantasy VII fanbase who would not stop badgering him about killing Aerith. In this section of the fan base are people who are obsessed with the term shipping. And if you don't know what shipping is, you're lucky. So props to you. But essentially these fans, they take specific fictional characters and they ship them together and they want them to be their OTP, their one true pairing, the two characters that are in love, they belong together and nobody else matters. And anyone else who gets in the way or is within the hemisphere of those characters deserves to die. It's very toxic, it's very childish and immature, and there's a section of the Final Fantasy fanbase that does that. It's really stupid. It's not just something in the Final Fantasy community. There's toxicity everywhere. Square Enix games in general, gaming, Marvel, Star Wars, DC, film, music, television, books, you name it. There are toxic people. I'm sure there's probably even toxic people in the Golden Girls fanbase. It's everywhere. So if you're someone out there who likes writing fanfiction and you like the idea of specific characters being together, that's fine. But you gotta keep that to yourself or post it on a blog somewhere. Do not harass the creators involved because of something you want. Just leave people alone. It's not hard to just give that respect to them. And lastly, they ask them, on a much happier note, if there will be any alternate costumes in Rebirth like we see in FF7 Ever Crisis. Kitase responds, for the moment we haven't thought about DLC, but regarding costumes, there are perhaps some that are very well hidden in Rebirth, with Hamaguchi saying, there will be more choices than in the previous game, so if you like spending time changing the look of characters, you'll have a good time. Extra costumes is something I really wanted in Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I guess story-wise it didn't really make sense, so getting new stuff in Rebirth, getting to showcase that, I'm very excited to see what kind of costumes they offer. I know in the past, Hamaguchi-san did make a point to say that they want to limit the costume changes, I believe, on your first playthrough, so that way it doesn't really kind of interrupt the tone and story flow. Last thing you want is Cloud looking like an a-hole in a cutscene where something very important is going on, so I think it will be slightly limited, but even then, I'm the type of person who's a bit of a purist. When I play a game and I get the option to change the costumes for my characters, I tend not to on my first playthrough. I like to stay close to the canon stuff as much as possible. I think about Spider-Man 2, you get a plethora of costumes for Peter and Miles in that game, and I always stuck with their base outfits for the whole game because it just felt right. It'll be interesting to see what costumes they offer for Rebirth. But with that being said, that's the video. My voice is going hoarse. Let me know in the comments down below about what you guys think about these questions. Is there anything in particular that you thought was fascinating about the QA? And I would really love to hear, what's the one feature in Rebirth that you're most excited to experience, whether it's combat, new outfits, world exploration, or some of the new story stuff. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.